you're here this evening, and especially to welcome Richard Harries and Julia Neuberger. Many of us know Richard, of course, because of his local residency and his frequency in this church, which we're all delighted to have him. And of course, he is known as a great thought leader in the church and of the Christian faith. And it's wonderful that this evening we have Julia Neuberger, also a great thought leader in another faith, in the Jewish faith, to balance, talk to, contrast, challenge, or whatever you're going to do with Richard.
Just enjoy, actually.
Just enjoy. Richard's autobiography, we've had many book events for Richard here over the last few years, many of them about art and so on. And so this is wonderful now to have his autobiography. It's a great read. I have read it. It's very good indeed, worth doing. And if you haven't already got one, I'm sure you'll get one this evening. So the order of events is that Julia and Richard will talk for 40-45 minutes. They'll then be open to questions from the audience. Then everyone has to go and buy a book at the back, which Richard will sign from this table over here. I hope that's okay. And so please welcome formally Richard Harries and Julia Neuberger.
Well, it's lovely to be with you all, and it's Richard, this is a great honour and pleasure. I was terribly touched when you invited me to do this. Richard and I are very old friends. We'll come on to how we met, but it's largely through interfaith activities. But I'm going to take him through this autobiography that I've read twice and think is absolutely brilliant, and you do all have to buy a copy. And actually, they're going to lock the doors, so until you have bought one, you won't be able to get out. But I'm going to take Richard through his life in stages, with some sort of just reflecting on things that happened. So I'm going to start really at your time at Wellington, at school, and you were quite sort of moderately negative about bits of your childhood and bits of your schooling, and you weren't really particularly a brilliant student or anything else. And then something happened to you at Wellington. Can you tell us about that?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for Julia for doing that. It's really, really very wonderful, because I know you are very, very busy, and thank you very much for everybody for being here. Now, if you had been asked me all those years ago when I was at school, how are things going? Of course, one said, fine. Oh, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That's the way you did things in those days. You just said everything was great. But actually, looking back, I wasn't quite as happy as I thought I was at the time, partly because my parents were abroad, partly because schooling in those days was an extremely rough business. I mean, I've visited one or two public schools recently, and they seem to be more like country clubs than schools. But I continue, read Charles Dickens and schools like that, his novels, and you'll get something of the flavour of schools they were 80 years ago. So they weren't particularly happy times, I think, for most people. But what really changed my life was a change in the tutor of my house. First of all, I had a tutor who was a really rather sad man, and the only thing he ever said to me was, "My boy, why aren't you working?" That's the only thing that ever went into my mind. He used to patrol the dormitories at night to make sure that everybody was doing their homework, and he used to come into my little sort of horse box. We had horse boxes, and he invariably found me in bed reading a novel, and he inevitably said the same thing, "My boy, why aren't you working?" Well, thank goodness I read novels, because actually that was a result of reading novels that I was able to produce my book, Haunted by Christ. But anyway, that changed. And the important thing is that a new tutor came in who seemed to think that this funny, not particularly distinguished young lad actually might have something to offer. And it totally changed my life to actually have somebody who believes in you and thought that you actually had some talent and had something to offer. And I think that does emphasize the absolutely crucial role of the teachers in our society, actually, and their willingness to believe in even the most average boy can actually transform that boy's life.
No, I think that's right, and you and I have talked about that a great deal. And I have a son who is a teacher, now a head teacher, in fact, and I think it's important. And they have to believe that these sometimes unpromising seeming young people really can achieve something. And you obviously had a tutor who thought, there's something here. You had to leave school early. Your father wanted you to...
Well, I wasn't expelled.
I don't know, I wasn't going to... I didn't mean that.
No,
Anything is possible, but I didn't mean that.
No, my father sort of thing, he thought he'd save a term's fees, I think,
Yeah.
it got me. So I took my A-levels from home and so that I could get into the army when I'd literally just turned 18. So joined the army at 18.
And that's very much what your father wanted, and your military family and all of that. And then?
Well, I drifted into the army,
I know.
rather, because, you know, in those days, Wellington, most people at Wellington had further parents who were in the services. Most of us went into the services. I enjoyed sport, and if you were in the army, you played a lot of sport. You got paid from an early age. You had a good social life. You know, what more would a young man want, frankly? Anyway, so I drifted into the army. I enjoyed Sandhurst. I enjoyed my time. I enjoyed time in the army.
And then you decided to change course. And that really did cause some problems, didn't it? Because you obviously weren't going to stay in the army, and you were going to Cambridge, and you had to change what you were going to do.
Well, I think it all began when I was at Sandhurst. A strange thought came into my mind that if Christianity is true, it should be at the center of your life. If it's untrue, give it up altogether. And I started to think a little bit about it. I started to read and gradually graduated to friends for whom it had meant something. And all I can say is that gradually the Christian faith gradually sort of took hold of me. There's a wonderful line in T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, which, as always with its best lines, he stole from someone else, from the 14th century mystical Cloud of Unknowing, the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling. I think that summed up my experience, the drawing of this love and the voice of this calling. Because I didn't come from a religious background at all. Later on in life, my parents were indeed very, very committed, but in the early part of my life growing up, my mother said she couldn't even get my father into church for Christmas Day. And the one time that we went to church, I can just remember one time we went to church because there was meant to be a good preacher. And I remember thinking to myself, it's just bad theatre, just ham acting, you know. It made absolutely no impression upon me at all. I had no role models in terms of clergy. The chaplain at my prep school once thought, I'm afraid in those days, called a weed, I think was the title one used for people like that. You know, I had absolutely no role models, no experience of church at all. But anyway, gradually the Christian faith took hold of me. And one day in the local library, when I was getting out one of my normal novels, I picked up a book by a Roman Catholic priest entitled Why I Was Ordained. Why should I have picked it up? I picked it up anyway. And when I picked it up, a funny thought came into my mind. Wouldn't it be funny if one day I was ordained? A few months later, that thought came back. A few months later, that thought came back. And then I was out in Germany, serving with the British Army of the Rhine, waiting to go to Cambridge to do mechanical sciences at the Army's expense, with a view to pursuing my career in the Army on the technical side, when I thought to myself, well, when I retire from the Army as a Major General with a nice fat pension, what a pleasant way of spending one's last days as a country parson. That was literally how it got into my mind. And as soon as that happened, literally slap bang, something came into my mind. If that's what you're meant to be doing, you'd better do it now. And it was literally like a volcano exploding inside me. I mean, like Martin Luther, I could do no other. I wrote to my parents to tell them what was happening. And they were appalled because they thought they'd got me off their hands and launched on a career. I wrote to the Queen, who was graciously pleased to let me retire from the Army. Officially, you had to do 5 years after Sandhurst. I hadn't done my 5 years, but the Queen graciously allowed me to go. So I went up to Cambridge as a civilian with no money, In fact, no college, first of all, because the original college where I was going to read science said they hadn't got any places for theology. They didn't do theology. So I had to write a rather badly written, handwritten letter around to all the colleges saying, anybody have me? You know, it was so easy in those days. You don't have to be clever like chaps now, and people now have to be so clever to get in. All very different in those days. Anyway, so that's that. And it was literally a volcanic experience. It was quite extraordinary.
And you didn't have any money either.
I didn't have any money, no.
And so, how did you manage?
Well, we had.
I'm very practical.
In those days, you were assessed on your parents' income as to whether you got any money from the state. And they decided that my father was earning too much money for me to get any money from the state, even the fact that I'd been away from my parents for 4 years. So I took it up with my MP, and thanks to my MP, he took it up and said that I'd been independent of my parents, for a long time, and he gave me a full state scholarship, which was wonderful. In those days, poor students now at university, they're crippled by debt when they leave university. In those days, we'd get scholarships from the state with everything paid for us. And it was quite enough to live on. We had quite a comfortable life on those scholarships from the state.
Absolutely. My parents used to give me an extra £50 a year so I could buy sherry. So it was really, it was a very, and I do think, if we might broaden later, but I do think that students now have a very rough time.
They do.
And that the older generation have had it much, much easier.
Oh, that's right.
And there is a question about fairness between generations, but we'll come on to that later, maybe. Okay, so you're at Cambridge, you've become a committed Christian, you get involved at Great St. Mary's, amongst other things, and then you go to Cuddesdon. That wasn't a direct journey, was it? Tell us a bit about theology at Cambridge and what really motivated you.
The important thing that happened then is not theology, it's life. It's actually meeting Joe.
Right. Well, that's probably more important.
No, Joe and I met properly our last week at Cambridge, fell in love very quickly. I think I proposed after 4 days. Then I tend to be rather headlong, I'm afraid. As will be obvious. But then we had a 2-year curling off period whilst she finished off her medical training in London and I had to go to theological college. But no, that was obviously crucially important for my life that we met and got engaged my last week at Cambridge. But then I went to Cuddesdon, which was very formative. It's a theological, well, Cambridge was fun. I loved Cambridge. I met some wonderful people who were huge influence on me. Some wonderful real role models, both in terms of what it is to be a Christian priest and what it is to operate intellectually in the modern world. It was hugely, hugely formative. But then at theological colleges are rather funny kind of affairs because you're all living in community. I can see somebody here who is at one who's nodding. I'm nodding. You've got about 60 or 70 rather intense students who all think they've been called by God, all trying to live together, worshipping together twice a day and eating together. So it's quite an intense community, as you can imagine. And in those days, they weren't quite so keen on women as they are today. In fact, the previous principal wouldn't allow any woman related to members of the college within about 10 or 15 miles, and the regime had rather loosened up when I went there, and women were allowed in for coffee after the Eucharist on Sunday, when it was assumed that the grace of the sacrament would keep the lusts of the young men down. And in those days, of course, the lusts of the young women hadn't even been thought of.
They hadn't been invented.
Or even invented, anyway. So women were allowed in for just sort of that half an hour after the Eucharist on Sunday. But anyway, luckily the principal, Bob Runcie, who became of Archbishop of Canterbury and a very good friend of ours, managed to find somewhere for me to live in the village. And Joe was able to come down at weekends to the farmhouse where I stayed. So that kept our relationship going over that 2 years. But it was a very formative period because you do learn the discipline of saying morning and evening prayer, of trying your best to say your prayers. and trying to be rooted in the spiritual life. And that, is particularly important for clergy, not least, today in the world where it is so difficult.
Yeah, and I think we learnt, so I went to Neuberger College, which is a theological college for training rabbis, and we were heavily influenced, in fact, not so much by Cuddesdon, actually by Westcott House, but I remember talking to you about it. We didn't have a tradition of prayers morning and evening because we didn't live together. We all lived, wherever we were living. But we did have morning prayers together. But the thing that was so impressive about the life of Westcott House, and actually I was there as a rabbinic student when they didn't yet have female Christian theological students, so I was a bit of a kind of outrage, I'm not sure. Anyway, but the thing that was so impressive was this extraordinary discipline, and it was very odd for Jews because we're not really used to this. But there was this feeling that it was a discipline that was imposed, but also very welcomed. And it was a very strange thing. So people were very deliberately learning and acquiring and imposing on themselves a particular kind of self-discipline and a particular way of being. And we weren't really experiencing that. I found it immensely moving. We spent a week at Westcott House as students. And in fact, I was taught to preach by Mark Santa, who later became Bishop of Birmingham. But it was this sense that it wasn't that they were telling you had to do this. It was, yes, of course they were, but that you were, as part of your vocation, deliberately taking on that discipline. And I think that's one of the reasons that places like Cuddesdon and Westcott House were so formative for people. Tell us a bit about Bob Runcie, why he was so influential. I loved him.
Yeah. I mean, he was quite simply a very great human being. I think he, more than any other human being I've known, had a capacity immediately to hone in on where people were and be sensitive to the kind of person they were. Although he moved easily in the kind of top circles, a lot of the top aristocratic Tories had fought with him in the Scots Guards in the war. He always made it quite clear to people and told them, my mother was a hairdresser in Liverpool. And I have been round a room with Bob Runcie, introducing to him people, and one moment he could talk to the press of classics about classics. The next person immediately talked to somebody, maybe perhaps about what it was like to be the son of a hairdresser in Liverpool. He had this extraordinary capacity to relate as a really great human being, a very warm human being. Wasn't necessarily a brilliant archbishop. He found it difficult, very difficult to make up his mind about things.
It's not the only one. Speaking from the outside, of course. I do think archbishops often find it quite hard to make up their minds.
Yeah.
I can see why, but chief rabbis aren't much better. It goes with the job, I think. Let's take you from Cuddesdon, and you went to Hampstead. You and I didn't meet. I was actually a brownie.
Yes.
Associated with your church.
Must be nice to be young. Yes, you were a brownie in Hampstead when I was a curate there, yes. Joe and I had 6 very happy years in Hampstead. They were extraordinary times. It was the 1960s. Everything really did change in the 1960s. And it was a quite extraordinary period. And there's a great gulf between the 1950s and everything that happened after that. And I mixed a lot with young people then, and all this revolution was happening, amongst the young people with whom I was mixing, though you were too young as a brownie quite to be involved. Though, of course, they always do say that if you remember the 1960s, you weren't really there, because what they say is the people who were rarely there were drugged up. But no, it was a very, very lively place to be, very intellectually stimulating, lots of wonderful people around, and we were very blissfully happy there.
A lovely place to live.
Lovely place to live, exactly.
Lots of interesting people around.
But I felt in the end, I'm a great believer in the end, you tend, whether you like it or not, you tend to take on the attitudes and the assumptions of the environment in which you live. And I began to realize that, it was desperately necessary to get out of Hampstead because that is, it's not, most places are not Hampstead. You needed to get out and actually live in a rather different kind of world.
And you did, but that wasn't the easiest move,
No,
was it?
that was funny enough, at the end of Hampstead, it's the one time in my life I knew precisely what I wanted to do. The one time, I'm not joking. What I wanted was to find a kind of middle city parish. I didn't want to go into an inner city parish in London with an eclectic congregation, nor did I want to go out to the edges to worship what the novelist E.M. Forster called the great suburban Jehovah. I wanted a kind of middle city parish which was socially mixed, and nothing seemed to be available. So I applied for 2 or 3 rather different kind of jobs, didn't get them. 2 or 3 things that didn't work my way. So then eventually I saw an advertisement to go and lecture in theology and ethics at a theological college. And although that wasn't something that I particularly wanted to do, I thought it might be interesting, as I couldn't find what I really wanted to do. And it was really very, very formative that for only a short period, 3 years, I had to lecture regularly week after week in theology and ethics at a theological college. And that, of course, laid a foundation for anything that one wanted to do, because we all know that it's only when you come to teach a subject that you really actually get into it and begin to learn it for yourself. When you actually have to deliver a lecture on the subject, you realize how little you really know. So that was very, 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 very formative. But then after 3 years lecturing at a theological college, I got a letter from the dear old Bishop of London at the time saying, "Dear Richard, I think I found what you wanted." Good for him. What a good bishop. Remembered what I wanted. All Saints Fulham. So I went to Fulham, which was precisely what I wanted. It was a socially mixed area with all sorts of possibilities for growth, for building up the congregation. And Joe and I had 9 years very hard work there, I have to say, but they were very important and formative years.
Tell us about that. Tell us about that, because that was a big congregational development. You built up that community. You did a huge amount with it. You did a lot with young people. You were very involved in sort of social action things. Tell us a bit about that, because that was quite formative, wasn't it?
Yes, well, we started a family service, a kind of multimedia family service, and built up. And of course, I was very fortunate in having very talented curates in those days. One of them who sang beautifully and played the guitar, and that helped. So we built up a family service. It was an interesting. I'm not altogether polite about Fulham in my book, as you'll see, because
I know
because it was an interesting. It was interesting because there were 3 groups of people in the church, all of whom were totally dedicated to the church and totally committed to it. But they all had very different visions about what the church should be. One group of people thought it was very important that the services in the church should be really beautiful, well ordered, everything beautifully organized. Everybody should be at the church at all the services. Another group of people in the church felt that what really mattered was serving the local community, Scouts, Cubs, and all the other activities. Another group thought that what's really important was the social life of the church. And they were all totally committed to the church, but all in different ways. And as long as me, as vicar, didn't identify with any one of them, but stood above the fray, we managed to get along. But it was quite a lesson in trying to hold a community together, which composed of people who had very different visions of what it was all about. I'm afraid I have 1 or 2 people here in the congregation who were actually on the PCC with me, so they will know when I first arrived there, PCC meetings, believe it or not, used to go on till midnight. And so the first thing I did was say, all meetings will stop at 9:30 at night. You can't make decisions after 9:30. But I'm afraid I did learn 1 or 2 wiles in how to manage things. I'm sorry, I always thought of myself as a rather naive, simple kind of person, but you develop 1 or 2 tricks, I'm afraid, with experience. And one was, the agenda of a meeting. Agendas of meetings are very, very important. So what I used to do, that if there was something that I knew people cared very, very deeply about, let us say, new loos for the church hall.
Yeah, really important.
Something that really, really gets people going. So I would have that first on the agenda. and people would really work at it for 3/4 of an hour. And then we'd come onto something that mattered to me, like totally new services and new liturgy. And we put that or second or third on the agenda. People were absolutely blown out by the time we got to that. We just nod this through. So you know, setting the agenda of meetings is really rather, everybody here knows that, you're all wily people. But that was a lesson I had to learn, trying to manage a congregation.
I learned it from Richard, because I was a bit younger and I was a congregational rabbi, and I was congregational rabbi till relatively recently.
Well, you had a huge congregation.
I did.
You know, the congregations, we had nothing compared with Julie. When she ran West London Synagogue, you had a roll of 5,000 people.
No, only 3. Don't exaggerate, only 3,000.
Only 3,000, well.
But I learnt that trick.
And anyway, Fulham was a doddle compared with you with West London Synagogue.
But you taught me about the agenda. So the real problem about being congregational rabbi is you don't set the agenda. However, you have to get very friendly with the person who does. And we wanted to get, this will be a big issue for all of you, we wanted to get gay marriage through. It had just gone through in Parliament, and we wanted to make gay marriage through. And I thought, I'm going to have some trouble with this at the synagogue board meeting. So we had a discussion about what was going to be in the window boxes, really important stuff, for about 40 minutes. And then we came on to the gay marriage thing, and it went through in 45 seconds. We won. We got it through. So there you are. But I learned a lot from you. You were amazingly helpful, actually, with those sorts of things. Okay, 9 years at Fulham, you built up an extraordinary congregation. I mean, you're very modest about it, and you may have had 3 very different communities within it, but you pulled them together, and it was a very, very successful, flourishing congregation when you left to go and be Dean of Kings. Why did you choose to go and be Dean of Kings?
A lot of people asked me to apply for it. I mean, I didn't think particularly of it, but literally 4 or 5 people said, you know, you ought to apply for this job. And it did turn out to be a wonderful job. It was one of the very few jobs you get in life which gives you a bit of time to do some creative things. I wasn't totally tied down by a day-by-day routine. And the college wanted me to do things outside because I had a bit of a media profile because of my prayers for the day and thoughts for the day. They wanted me, on behalf of the college, to do things outside. They wanted me to do some creative things in the college. And it's very, very rare that you get an opportunity to do a job like that, where you do have a certain amount of leeway for creative things.
And you did some amazing things while you were there, and that's actually really when we met properly. But you did some amazing things. That's when you, I think, got involved in the Council for Arms Control.
Yeah.
And it's also when you and I were involved in campaigning on the AIDS issue. You said it wasn't a campaign, it was a campaign. Right. You were very brave about that. Tell us a bit about the Council for Arms Control, and tell us a bit about AIDS.
Well, you were on the Council for Arms Control.
I was.
Yeah, I mean, we were both together on the Council for Arms Control, which, as its title indicates, believed in multilateral disarmament rather than unilateral disarmament. We're talking about the 1980s. It was the height of the Cold War. CND was very, very active. Julia and I both believe, with what I still call spiritual fear and moral trembling, that the presence of nuclear weapons means, for the first time in human history, it could not be in the interest of one side to go to war with another country which had nuclear weapons, because it meant the obliteration of both of them. So there was a kind of nuclear stalemate. So we were both involved in the Council for Arms Control, which was pushing for multilateral disarmament, a reduction of arms controls. But also at King's, we had a very good war studies department. We had the Institute for Strategic Studies just up the road, and various other think tanks. So I thought a lot about the nature of armed force, the use of armed force in the world, in the modern world, and met some very, very influential people who actually helped shape my thinking on that as well, and started to do writing on those areas. But so that was a period where I really started getting involved in public theology and the public sphere in a very major kind of way.
And you began doing this thing which I think has been really, really important and has, I think, influenced the nation very considerably, which is what you call public theology, and some people here might call public policy, but it's marrying the two.
Yeah.
And I think that was really important. Tell us about AIDS, because you and I did a lot on that.
On AIDS?
On AIDS. Tell us about that.
Well, I think you slightly overestimate what I did on that. I rather wished I'd done more, I think. I'm not sure that I was alert enough on that. You know, there are some issues that you don't feel that you did enough on. And I
you don't remember?
I don't really know. I think I should have done more on that.
I think you did a huge amount. There was a lot of stuff, as people may remember, about people not wanting to share communion with people who are gay, and you spoke out against that.
Yeah.
There was the whole thing, I don't know whether people would remember this, but you know, people talking about the gay plague. There was a huge amount of homophobia. And you spoke out very, very publicly about that. You may not think it was brave, but it was brave at the time.
I'll tell you a story that I'm still rather haunted by. When I was at Hampstead, a man suddenly started to appear at our main morning service. Now, in those days, there was a service called Matins, where we had a full choir, beautifully sung, but it was very stately and very formal. And suddenly, a rather unusual person started to come to this. They're not the normal kind of person who would come to a stately Matins. And I got to know him and heard his story. His earliest memories were being brought up in Australia by his grandparents, because I think both his parents were drug addicts. He remembers crawling around the floor, you know, with both his parents totally stoned out. He came to London. He worked as a male prostitute on Hampstead Heath. And for some reason, he suddenly started to come to church. And I remember him telling me his life story. And then he said to me, out of this mess has come me. And it's one of the most triumphant, wonderful statements I've ever heard. Out of this mess has come me. He was absolutely wonderful himself. But the reason why I'm remembering it now is that later on, he had AIDS. And I went to visit him. And he felt very, very bitter that the church had not been more positive about gay people. And I think he felt that I hadn't been, at that stage, positive enough. But that's always slightly haunted me, his extraordinary story.
Well, he may have felt that you hadn't been supportive enough, but I do remember, because I remember speaking on the same platform as you, and it wasn't really difficult for me. I was a, Reform rabbi, and we could, the Orthodox weren't going to take the same line, but we could more or less say what we like, non-conformist, really. And you were saying some things that I think, on the whole, the Church of England wasn't very comfortable with at the time, and that continued. It also continued with Geoffrey John. Do you want to tell us about that?
There may be one or two people who possibly remember that. As a diocesan bishop, I had the great privilege and responsibility of appointing assistant bishops or area bishops. And the Diocese of Oxford is very big, so I had 3 area bishops, the Bishop of Reading, Bishop of Dorchester, and the Bishop of Buckingham. And when the vacancy came, I interviewed a group of people, as usual, and decided that the best candidate by far, was this man called Geoffrey John, who was well known as a gay campaigner and who had a partner. So, in liaison with Rowan Williams, the Archbishop at the time, I nominated him, and first of all, Rowan agreed to consecrate him. And then there was such a bitter campaign against this from the conservative factions, not only in the Church of England, but in the Anglican Communion. So endless emails, huge amount of sort of protest meetings going on. Eventually, Rowan Williams actually withdrew his willingness to consecrate Geoffrey John. So he and I were both summoned to Lambeth Palace at 7:30 one Sunday morning before the press could get there in order to break the news to us. Poor Geoffrey John was absolutely hounded by the national press.
Awful.
It was really absolutely appalling. And it was a very, very difficult time. I had mass meetings with conservative evangelical clergy who had kept on trying to pressure me in order to withdraw my nomination, which I refused to do. And it was an extremely difficult period. My first thought was to resign straight away, because it was clearly totally wrong to nominate somebody and then actually find that actually we can't get him forward because of the opposition to it. But I'm glad actually I did eventually decide not to resign straight away and stayed on till 70 when we had to retire. But although you were kind enough to say I'd been a very sort of positive pro-gay before that, that was really what actually made me absolutely adamant. I had somebody I knew would be the best person for the job, absolutely head and shoulders above every other person, and it seemed to be an absolute scandal that it wasn't able to be appointed because he had a partner.
Yep. And it's taken a very long time, and it's still not completely sorted, but you've been amazing on that. Let's move on, because we're going to run out of time soon, to the House of Lords. And you've loved the House of Lords, and you've been there really quite a while.
I wouldn't put it as strongly as that, Julia.
You always seem for me to love the House of Lords.
I wouldn't put it as strongly as that.
You seem very comfortable there. How can I put it?
A bit too comfortable, perhaps.
No. You've used it, quite rightly, as a place to campaign from. And you've taken up particular issues. You wouldn't automatically have gone into the House of Lords. You were in the House of Lords as a bishop, but when you retire as a bishop, you normally don't continue. So you were put forward, which was wonderful, and we were all absolutely thrilled. And you've been there, and talk a bit about what you've done while you've been there, because it's been
Yes, well, as you say,
great.
26 bishops are in the House of Lords anyway, but as a bishop, you retire. When you retire as a bishop, you lose your place in the House of Lords. But I think a few people, including you, Julia, I'm pretty certain, agitated inappropriate causes, whatever they are. So I found myself recycled.
The difficult bit was finding out what the appropriate quarters were.
Yeah.
That was the difficult bit. Yeah, there was quite a lot of campaigning for you.
Anyway, by some mysterious process, I suddenly found myself there as a secular lord rather than... So I'm no longer my Lord Bishop, but I am the Right Reverend the Lord Harries of Pentragarth now, I believe, in the House of Lords. No, but I mean, more seriously, it has been an opportunity to pursue a number of human rights issues about which I care very deeply. I'm not going to go into them all in each, but one is the Dalits, the former untouchables, who are still one of the most disgracefully discriminated group of people in the world. And it's not just in Southeast Asia, because a certain amount of discrimination on the ground of caste has come into this country and into America. So the Dalits has always been a concern of mine. And there are various other ones as well. But it is an opportunity in order to pursue a number of, quite focused, specialized causes.
And to keep bringing them back. One of the things you can do in the House of Lords is you can keep asking questions, you can keep bringing things back, and I do think that you've done that amazingly, not only the Dalits, but also on West Papua, on Georgia, whatever. Because we're running out of time, I'm going to move you on to interfaith and the Manor House Group, another area where you and I collaborated quite a lot. Tell us about that and why it was so important to you, because it was.
Julia and I really got to know one another I don't know, about 40 years ago, when we were both members of a group called the Manor House Group, which was a group of rabbis and priests who used to meet regularly for 2 or 3 days a year in London and then go away for a weekend together. And we used to read one another's papers and criticize one another, and eventually came a book out of it. And I think it was hugely formative on all the members of that group, certainly on me, and I think on you as well, Julie. That when you're really committed to a group and you're meeting regularly and engaging seriously, it's hugely influential in the way it changes your whole perspective, particularly the weekends, which we used to stay together. We used to go to a Quaker retreat house in the far ends of Oxfordshire for weekends together. And actually spending a weekend together with rabbis and priests, that was wonderful. And what we found, of course, was that it was what really diverged was the non-theological issues. I mean, one of them was that when a Christian priest reads a paper, everybody listens very carefully and attentively and wait till they stop and then comes in. When a rabbi reads a paper, all the other rabbis present immediately step in after he got through one sentence in order to argue with it. Yes. I mean, it was quite extraordinary. And
you were so shocked.
Yes, it was absolutely. Yes, it was amazing. The other one was that we used to go for a wonderful walk on the ridgeways on the afternoon we had together. And what we found is that all the Christians bought their walking boots or Wellington boots, and of course the rabbis came in their dark, shiny city shoes.
And didn't possess walking boots. That was the exception.
So these non-theological differences were the ones.
Oh, you haven't mentioned going to the pub. Don't you remember? So Charney Manor was dry.
Oh.
And so what really united, I mean, it wasn't only the theology, what really united the Christian priests and the rabbis was that quite a lot of us actually fancied a glass of wine. We weren't real lushes or anything like that. We just wanted a glass of wine. So we all went off to the pub together. And I do remember that as being one of the kind of seminal moments that we all realized, you know what, a drink would really be very nice.
Yeah, absolutely.
You just don't remember that anymore, but it was really, I thought that was one of those seminal moments as well. Okay, we're coming towards the end. You and I have worked together on a whole variety of things, and we've remained really very close friends, and we go walking together, and we see each other. What do you really still want to do? What have you still got as ambition? You are quite an ambitious person. What do you still want to do?
I'm not. Julia gave me warning of this question. I couldn't really think what on earth to say because I don't really work in terms of ambitions like that.
It might be just writing another book. I don't know.
Well, I've written I've got.
You're always writing books.
I've written far too many already, and I've got several more books all stocked up, ready to come. But I mean, no, I'm not sure that I have got it. I mean, I know that sounds very, very, very dull.
No.
Perhaps live well, die well.
Yeah.
You know, when you get to my age, coming up to 87, you have to think about these things. It's all right for a young person like you, but...
I'm 73 and I'm thinking like that too, so don't...
No.
Living well and dying well, I think that's right.
I think live well and die well, that's
Okay, and what are you proudest of?
Well, again, we're not allowed to be proud of things, are we? I mean, pride is a sin.
I'm Jewish.
Well, I don't think the Hebrew Scriptures approves of pride either, frankly.
The things you're really pleased you've done.
Well, I'm very proud that I have two children who turned out to be very decent people. And those people who know them here will know two very decent people are children. Well, that's important, isn't it? I think I wouldn't say I'm proud because I don't believe in pride in that sense. I think the thing I probably do best, to be honest, would be my radio broadcasts. It's a medium that suits me. I'm a great admirer of Clement Attlee, about whom it was said that he never used one word when none would do. I think that, this short format, 2 minutes, 45 seconds, I like it. You can say something in 2 minutes, 45 seconds. You could spread it to 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and not say anything. I like the challenge of trying to say something significant in that very, very short compass. So I think that's probably the thing, actually, which suits me best.
I think you do it brilliantly, and it is a way of talking to the nation, so it's fantastic. Thank you very much. We've got to leave it there because we would like to give you an opportunity to ask questions. Now, if you were an entirely Jewish audience, some of you may be, I don't know, but if you were, I would be making a comment right now, which is, we would like questions, not statements. Now, I don't know whether that's possible for this particular audience, but we have a roving mic, and would anybody like to ask Richard a question? At the back, right at the back there. And please don't be shy. We've only got about 10 minutes, so get your questions in.
Thank you very much, both of you, for a wonderful conversation. Been very heartened by the interfaith element and how rabbis and priests have got together in the past. The question is, what about the third large faith, Islam? And where's the reconciliation or the getting together with that particular faith?
Thank you very much for that good question. The good news is that there is a lot of dialogue going on with Muslims, with Jews and Christians. Julia can say something about Jews and Muslims, because a lot is going on there. When I went to Oxford, I convened the Oxford Abrahamic Group, which brought together Jews, Muslims, and Christians on a regular basis, very much like the Manor House Group, which we had in London with Jews and Christians. So it is going on. But something particularly significant, I think, is going on with Jews and Muslims. I think, Julia, you say something on that.
So the most significant thing has been actually in relatively recent years. We've had a Jewish Christian Muslim group that's been meeting for many, many, many years. And my synagogue, just so for those who don't know, is just off Edgware Road. There's a Middle Eastern supermarket right next door. We're in the middle of Little Lebanon, as it's known locally. And the relationships are incredibly good, which is not necessarily what people would assume. But it's been a lot of work, I think, on both sides. So some of the examples, there've been long-standing dialogue groups, and that's with the Regent's Park Mosque and so on. But the things that have been really important are that during Ramadan, the dinner, the breaking the fast, is called an iftar. And my synagogue holds an iftar for the local Muslim community every year at Ramadan. And that's been hugely popular. When we started it, you know, most of the Muslims who'd come had never been in a synagogue. I mean, why would they really? But like most of us, had never been in a mosque. And the result of that was, you know, they came and they visited the synagogue, then they came and joined us for various festivals. We all then went to the mosque and so on. And then the best part of all of that, and this I'm talking really locally, because actually, if you really want to do stuff that's important, quite often it has to be relatively local. And the most important thing was when one of the local mosques had to be rebuilt. They'd had some terrible sort of building disaster, and they were going to be out of their mosque for 6 months. And they used our synagogue hall for their Friday prayers for that 6 months. Now, that would not have been possible 20 years ago. So there's an enormous amount going on. Doesn't mean it's always easy, and it doesn't mean that it's always comfortable. And at the moment, with what's going on in Israel, it's definitely quite uncomfortable, although most of the Jews that I know are just as upset anyway. But that's not, you know, it can be quite uncomfortable. But there's a huge amount going on. I do want to pay tribute to one particular person who did an enormous, well, two people who did an enormous amount to make this possible, long before I was doing stuff within the synagogue. And that was the Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, who's not really renowned for this. But he started a Jewish Christian Muslim group working with the Jordanian royal family. And Prince Hassan of Jordan and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, between them brought a group of people together and said, come on guys, you have to do some of this stuff. And they said it in the kind of nicest possible way, but no was not a possible answer. And I think that was really quite important.
Yeah. I was a member of that.
I know you were.
And you were as well. Yeah, that's right.
Can I tell a story about that? Have we got time for a story? Okay. So the first time that we went to Jordan, and I don't think, Richard, you were there yet. So and there were only 3 Jews going to Jordan, and Jordan didn't have any Jewish visitors in those days. Now they're 2 a penny. And it was over the Sabbath, so I needed to take my Friday night candles with me, and they were in my luggage, and we were going first class on Royal Jordanian Airlines. It was all very grand, etc., and the plane didn't take off, And after a bit, the security guy came along and said to me, very embarrassed, and said, there's something in your luggage, and it just looks like 2 sticks of dynamite. I said, I'm really sorry, it's my Shabbat candles. I need to light my candles. And they said, you know, we could have given you candles in Jordan. I said, well, I didn't know what. Anyway. But anyway, from that, many things have grown. Other people who'd like to ask questions. So here, and then just behind you, and over there. And that's probably all we've got time for.
Having read some of your Haunted by Christ, looking at the other side, doubts about faith, and sometimes it comes out that the value of faith is in the doubting and getting away from it and saying, scrub Christianity. What is your view on that sort of problem? Or perhaps it's not a problem, it's a gift.
Well, I'm never very happy with the word doubt. I think a better word is question. And I think that if we're able to use our minds to question at all, of course we want to use our minds to question about religion. And I would say that questioning is part of faith. And very often it's through questioning that actually you come to a deeper faith. And I think both Pascal and T.S. Eliot said that the more mature the faith is, the more you will be aware of the questions about it and perhaps the challenges that are to it. And I actually think that it is probably the person who's most deeply committed to the faith who is actually most aware of the challenges to that faith. So the two are not mutually exclusive, but actually go together. But I think there's a particular challenge today because we live in the highly, highly skeptical society with a media which is characterized by an attitude of disdain to religion, particularly the Christian religion, which makes it very, very difficult in order to actually put something across which has any kind of persuasive power with the wider public.
Just behind you, yes. Yes, there. And then over there, and that's it, I'm afraid.
Do you think the scriptures are the divine revelation of God and the manifestation of the prophecies which were concluded in Jesus Christ?
I believe that the scriptures are inspired, but of course they're inspired through human beings. They're all the documents of the Hebrew scriptures and in the New Testament are written by human beings. And actually, if have a longer talk with you about afterwards, Paul, that sometimes that if one doesn't actually believe in the literal interpretation of particular text, you come to actually a higher understanding of scriptural interpretation. I mean, St. John's Gospel, for example, I think a lot of it is best seen as an interpretation of the fundamental truth of Christ. But this means that the inspiration is in the interpretation, not in just what happened, but actually in the interpretation of what happened. So I actually take a rather high view of Scripture.
And can I just say the answer is no, because I think that certainly the Hebrew scriptures, I'm not qualified to comment on anything else, but the Hebrew scriptures are plainly written down by human beings, actually male human beings, and that we can tell that from the way that the text is framed. We know that there are various different sources. What is clear is that those people who were writing those texts down either believed that they were divinely inspired or were divinely inspired. But this is human work. It's through human agency. And for us, the job, the duty, is to read those texts and get from them what is that kernel, what is that divine inspiration, what is this thing that we can really learn from this. So I wouldn't say, is it true in the sense that you would say, but I'd say there's a huge amount we can learn from it. Okay, last one.
Thank you both for everything we've heard tonight. I just wondered if you'd be kind enough to make any comments about the forthcoming coronation and the fact that our now king to be coronated, he, as a Prince of Wales, he very much wanted to be the defender of faiths, plural, but as I understand it, the coronation ceremony is still very much traditional Anglican English. Thank you.
Well, I think thank you very much for that question. The short answer at the moment, we don't know exactly what form the coronation is going to take. I mean, very little has been divulged. I would say I was involved in in a kind of think tank trying to think through what the promises should be, what the oaths should be. They could be very varied. The oaths that the sovereign has made at the coronation has varied a lot from monarch to monarch. They're not all set. So I think there's quite a lot of scope there for Charles to put on in something different. I'm sure myself that there will be some recognition of other faiths in one way or another. I'm sure there will. What form that will take, it's impossible to tell at the moment. It'll be very interesting to see.
It will be very interesting to see. I've been involved with our local vicar in Primrose Hill, where I live, in a podcast about the significance and the theological significance of the coronation, but of course we don't know its exact form. But we do know that the chief rabbi will be there. It's on the Jewish Sabbath. He wouldn't normally, he's Orthodox, so he wouldn't be able to travel. So he will actually be staying with the king and the queen on that Friday night, and they will be having a Jewish Sabbath as well as then the coronation the next day. I think that's an acknowledgement of other faiths and the other faiths that are present in the country. And I don't know more than that, but I do happen to know that. And I'm afraid at this point we've got to stop, which is really sad. You've been amazing, Richard, and thank you very, very much. And we are going to have a chance to get Richard to sign our copy. He's got to sign mine, actually. He's going to sign copies, so I do hope everybody is going to buy a copy and get one signed. And thank you all for being an amazing audience as well.
Well, I repeat that, and thank you very much, Richard and Julia, for a fascinating conversation and bringing out so many aspects. There are so many aspects of Richard's life which he hasn't mentioned, which are in the book, which are worth finding out about. I discovered one of the things I've always, having known Richard for some time, that I'd always be interested as how he got the title of Lord Harris of Pentragarth. Well, I now know where Pentragarth is, but you have to read the book to find out. So thank you very much indeed. Richard, as I say, we'll sign some books. And again, please give our thanks to...
Can I, first of all, because I haven't had a chance to say thank you, can I thank Julia very much indeed. Julia is hugely, hugely busy running all these hospital trusts. It's very good of you to come. And I'd like to thank Andrew once again for the meticulous way he organized these events. And I'd like to thank our wonderful local bookshop. It's so good to have our books up here. So thank you.
You wanted a photo? Yes, you've got to sit. I'll have... Yeah, will you hold the book and sit just for a minute? We're going to have a photo. Stand, okay. Sorry, I'm told we're standing. Want an arm? You hold it.